With me now is the former senior investigator for the House Foreign Affairs Committee, Jerry Dunleavy. Jerry, good to see you. Thanks for joining me.
Thank you, Liz. Appreciate it as always.
Okay, Jerry, you and I talked on this show about a year ago. It was a very highly rated episode. Viewers were very interested in what you were doing, investigating the botched withdrawal, Biden's botched withdrawal of Afghanistan. That was a year ago, however, and it's been even longer than that since this withdrawal of Afghanistan. So could you give our viewers a brief overview of who you are and what your job was until just a day or two ago in Congress?
Yeah. So I originally was a investigative reporter working at the Washington Examiner, where I covered the disastrous withdrawal from Afghanistan. I then co-authored a book with my great friend, James Hassan, who is a veteran of the war in Afghanistan. And then I was asked to come on to the House Foreign Affairs Committee to help with their investigation into the withdrawal. So was asked to be a senior investigator on Capitol Hill. And I started that job just over a year ago. And, after a lot of soul searching because of the ineffectiveness of the investigation and the chairman's unwillingness and the committee's unwillingness to do really the basic things that the investigation needed to be doing, I did decide to resign in protest because of the direction, or really the directionlessness of the committee's investigation. And my resignation was effective on Friday, and I publicly released my resignation letter on Monday because I really think that the Abbey-Gate Gold Star families needed to know the reality about this investigation. I thought the American people did as well, because it's too important of an issue to remain silent about.
And I think something that I want to note here is the chairman of the House Foreign Affairs Committee, Congressman Mike McCaul, is ostensibly a Republican. He has an R behind his name. He should be part of the Republican Party. The Republicans are supposed to be the party that is speaking out against this deadly withdrawal from Afghanistan. I mean, we all remember just the gut-wrenching feeling when we heard that Biden was withdrawing from Afghanistan in the way that he did, essentially giving Afghanistan back to the Taliban and costing us 13 American military service members' lives. Absolutely atrocious. It's intolerable, actually, from the White House here. But when you say that this investigation was not done correctly, that the things that needed to be investigated were not, can you give us tell us exactly how this investigation should go and what the chairman refused to do?
Yeah. So what I would say is there were tons of questions that the committee should be asking that they refused to ask, witnesses that the committee should have been bringing in that they didn't, documents that the committee should have been forcing to be handed over that they refused to do. And these were all things that for months and months and months I was pushing repeatedly and relentlessly to get done, and there was a refusal to do it. And then when it came to the witnesses that we did bring in, we often treated these folks with kid gloves. I mean, letting them off the hook. Zalmay Khalilzad is a great example. He was the architect of the Doha Agreement. President Biden kept him on to continue his failed negotiations with the Taliban. And what I can say from my journalistic investigation, from writing my book, and from what I learned on the committee, Zal was a nefarious guy. And
how so?
Zal was our main interlocutor with the Taliban, and the deal that he agreed to was a bad deal, and he continued his disastrous negotiations with the Taliban in 2021. He refused to acknowledge and admit the true nature of the Taliban. And this is the person that the United States first under Trump and then under Biden when the Taliban took over. This is the guy that we were relying on to negotiate with the Taliban. So bad guy.
What was his deal, though? Was he ideologically compromised? Was he financially bribed? Was he poor skill-wise at his job? What was his deal?
It's a great question, and it's part of the mystery surrounding Zal. What was motivating him to be what I would say is a pretty nefarious actor? Ultimately, it's tough to suss out exactly what was motivating Khalilzad, but what I can just say is that he's not an honest guy. He's not an honest broker, and when it came to the committee's handling of him, treated him with kid gloves. Unfortunately,
What does that
that
mean,
was
kid gloves?
didn't ask him tough questions. The design of the hearing itself, like the title of the hearing itself, about we're bringing in Zalmay Khalilzad and then just saying how the Biden administration failed to enforce the Doha Agreement. That essentially was an effort to say, Zal is a friendly witness. The Doha deal was great, and he's just here to kind of talk about that. Whereas that was an opportunity to really nail him for what he did in 2020, and to nail the Biden administration for keeping on such a bad actor. But that's not the direction
Can you
the
explain what
committee
the
went.
Doha Agreement is, in case anybody watching is not familiar with that?
Yeah, so that was an agreement that was struck between the U.S. and the Taliban in 2020, which essentially laid out a series of things that the Taliban would agree to do and that the United States would agree to do, including the United States agreeing to withdraw if the Taliban followed through on its commitments. The Taliban, of course, followed through on none of its commitments. Under President Biden, the United States withdrew anyway. Zal, as our top negotiator with the Taliban, has just refused to be honest about the nature of the Taliban, has refused to be honest about the nature of the deal that he struck. And so when the committee brought him in, it was a problematic direction to take with him, because the sense from the chairman on down was that Zal is a friendly witness, and instead of treating him the way that he should have been treated, as a man who was extremely crucial part of why Afghanistan fell. And the way that we treated Zal with kid gloves, we also then went on to treat General Milley and General McKenzie with kid gloves as well when we brought them in. And I can talk a little bit more about that if you're interested.
Yeah, please. I want to hear the details. What was asked that shouldn't have been asked, or what wasn't asked that should have been asked?
Yeah. So General Milley and General McKenzie were sort of the two highest ranking military officials in 2021. Milley as the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, McKenzie as the commander of Central Command, which includes within his remit Afghanistan. So both of these guys. So let me give them a little bit of credit. Both of them did warn President Biden that withdrawing the 2,500 troops that Trump had kept in Afghanistan, both those generals warned President Biden that to rapidly withdraw all of those U.S. troops without a plan would be a bad idea. So they were right about that. But they were also wrong about very significant things. General Milley testified in the summer of 2021 about how many districts the Taliban was in control of at that time. And he demonstrated in his congressional testimony that he was not on top of things. The Taliban's advances were way beyond what he told Congress. So he didn't understand the state of play on the ground. He also greatly misled
ignorance, or was that deliberately misleading Congress?
It's an incredible question. I honestly think that it was probably ignorance. I think that the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff just didn't know what the state of play was. He was oblivious to the facts on the ground, and that's a big problem, because the Taliban was advancing rapidly across Afghanistan. And yes, the White House screwed up the most, and this is on President Biden. The State Department performed horrifically at every step of the way. But when the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff doesn't know what the state of play is, doesn't understand the rapidness of the Taliban advances, that's a problem. On top of that, Milley greatly inflated the size of the Afghan military in the summer of 2021, saying that the Afghan military and police forces were 325 or 350,000 strong. Everybody knew that was never true. It was never even close to being true, but it was especially not true in the summer of 2021 when the Afghan military had lost its U.S. support, its U.S. logistics, was under assault from the Taliban, and the military and police were rapidly falling apart. So I say all of that about General Milley to say that while he was right to tell Biden, don't withdraw 2,500 U.S. troops, he, as an important military commander, did not understand the reality of the Taliban and our Afghan military allies. So General McKenzie.
Well, giving the president information that's poor about the security state of Afghanistan or the strength of the Taliban is almost the same thing as saying go ahead and withdraw, because if you exaggerate the situation in the favor of, oh, it would be fine if we did withdraw, that, then it's the same thing as saying go ahead, even if he technically said don't, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
Let me ask you this. So you're talking about these different people, Milley and McKenzie and Khalilzad, being treated with kid gloves. These are some of the witnesses that were called before the committee. Were there witnesses that were not called before the committee that should have been?
Yeah, absolutely. And let me just put a fine point on the Milley-McKenzie hearing, kind of how to give you a sense of this kid gloves thing that I'm saying. So originally the hearing title, and this is just a great little anecdote, the hearing title was something to the effect of, originally when it was announced, a strategic failure, America's generals and the Taliban takeover. It was something to that effect. General Milley complained to Chairman McCaul, hey, this hearing title makes it seem like I might be partly to blame with what happened. Like, you need to change it. And, when I was pushing for these various hearing titles, that was the point. Like, General Milley and General McKenzie were not without fault. They played a role in this as well. But General Milley complained to Chairman McCaul that it seemed like he was getting blamed a little bit. And so Chairman McCaul agreed to completely change the hearing name to something like, examining the Biden administration's failures, America's generals testify, right? It was something to that effect, right? So that gives you a sense of just, if the way that you approach a hearing with important figures that you're trying to hold accountable and get answers out of, it's all about the approach to start with. And if your approach is signaling to them that you're letting them off the hook, and signaling to all of the other members of the committee that let's go easy on these guys, it's no wonder if it's not a productive hearing, if you don't get what you need. So,
well, what's McCall's deal? We'll get to the witnesses that he should have talked to in a second, but what's his deal? Why is he so soft on these people? He's the chair of the Foreign Affairs Committee. He should be a hawk on this stuff. Again, is it ideology? Is it weakness? Is it money? Is it him wanting power? Like, what's his deal?
Yeah. So my strong sense in conversations with senior staff and even with the chairman is that sort of a decision was made within the committee that this wasn't really the military's fault. The military's not to blame. And so, here's how I look at it. The U.S. service members on the ground, those Marines, those soldiers, when they got sent in during the evacuation, what they did in that deadly and chaotic and horrific situation with the U.S. relying on the Taliban to provide security against ISIS-K, they performed acts of heroism that, I could go on and on about. These were incredibly brave and effective guys, and there's no other military in the world that could have pulled off what those boots on the ground did. But the military commanders, the military brass, the generals, they did not do what they needed to do to set our service members up for success. And so that's the delineation that I would always try to make, that I made in the book that I co-authored, and that I always try to make on the committee, is that, look, when we're talking about the military needing to be held accountable, we're talking about the military brass and the generals need to be held accountable for the mistakes that they made, just like we need to hold the State Department accountable for their failures, the intelligence community accountable for their failures, and ultimately President Biden, supported by Vice President Harris, they're the ones that made this decision, and they need to be held accountable as well. But you can't let military commanders and generals off the hook, because, look, we lost a 20-year war, and we're in an era of great power competition now. The next war that we get in is probably going to be against a very significant and serious adversary, and there were unnecessary Gold Star families created because of the way that this withdrawal and evacuation happened, those Abbey Gate Gold Star families. And what I worry about is, I think that we have failed to properly get answers for them and accountability for them. But I also worry that the next war, if we don't learn our lessons, if we don't hold everyone accountable, from the president to the diplomats to the generals, if we don't hold all of them accountable, the next war that we fight, I fear that there's going to be more unnecessary Gold Star families. And so that was my motivation this whole time on the committee, trying to get them to understand why this is such a big deal and why it's so important to hold everybody accountable and not let some people off the hook.
It's not just politics. It's not just policy. This is people's lives we're talking about, lives lost,
right,
and the lives of their family members. Well, you mentioned that General Milley and General McKenzie advised President Biden not to withdraw the 2,500 American troops that were on the ground in Afghanistan. Biden and Harris did so anyway. Do we know who was in Biden and Harris's ear telling them to withdraw?
Yeah. Well, what I will say is that this was a decision made by President Biden. I think that the evidence is very clear that President Biden's not mentally fit to be president. That's been clear for a long time. But on this issue of Afghanistan and the withdrawal from Afghanistan, this is a decision that he really did make. It's something that he's wanted to do. He wanted to make his mark on the war in Afghanistan. He picked the 20th anniversary of 9/11 for our full withdrawal, which of course meant that on the 20th anniversary of 9/11, the Taliban, those who harbored Al-Qaeda and continue to harbor Al-Qaeda to this day, the Taliban was back in charge in Afghanistan. So ultimately, this was a decision made by President Biden. Vice President Harris was very proud to brag at the time, in April 2021, when President Biden made his announcement. Vice President Harris was very happy to brag at the time that she was the last person in the room when Biden made his decision, and she openly, defended his decision-making process. I don't think that she's been so publicly forthcoming since the disaster unfolded. But President Biden and the people around him supported him in this decision, and so it's ultimately on them as well.
It's an undercover important topic for the election, I think. People forget how the sort of gut reaction, the visceral reaction that we all had, and that horrendous day when we lost all of our fellow Americans over there, and that Biden did this purely to win political points, and that it was Biden surrendering Afghanistan after this 20-year war. So go back to the witnesses for a second, and maybe this is related to the ISIS-K attack at Abbey Gate. You said that there are leads that were not run down. Does this are you implying that there were intelligence failures that had we properly had the intelligence community properly communicated with military brass, we could have avoided this and avoided the deaths? Or can you explain this more?
Well, here's what I know. And these are things that were uncovered in our book, and then more evidence has arisen related to them because of it, because of what we found in our book. So what we found in our book is that the U.S. intelligence community knew that ISIS-K was staging in a hotel 2 to 3 kilometers away from Kabul airport during the evacuation in August 2021. The U.S. military asked the Taliban to raid that location, and the Taliban refused to do that. So that is something that we found in our book. What has come out since then, General McKenzie has now admitted that actually it wasn't just one instance of the Taliban refusing to search or raid an ISIS-K location for us during the evacuation, but it actually happened a bunch of times. Okay? So this is the group that the U.S. was relying upon because of a series of bad decisions from President Biden to General McKenzie. The Taliban is now in Kabul. We're relying on the Taliban to provide security for us outside the airport, and the Taliban is refusing to help us with the ISIS-K threat against the airport. Now, mind you, the Taliban had just freed thousands of prisoners from Bagram Air Base, which we had abandoned just a few weeks prior, and one of those prisoners was an ISIS-K terrorist who went on to carry out the bombing at Abbey Gate. So that is a big deal. There are a number of witnesses that we could have brought in who were military commanders who, during the evacuation, were in direct communication with the Taliban. We're talking with the Taliban every day, and we're the ones that were asking the Taliban, hey, we think that ISIS-K is over here. Hey, can you do this? Hey, can you do that? And sometimes the Taliban would tell the U.S. military to go pound sand. And we know how that worked out with one of the ISIS-K terrorists blowing himself up at Abbey Gate. So General Donahue, General Farrell Sullivan, Rear Admiral Peter Vaisley, these are folks that I've been pushing for essentially since I joined the committee last year, for the committee to bring in for transcribed interviews so we can talk to these guys for 8-10 hours and ask them everything that they know about what it was like at the evacuation, what the reality was of the Taliban, what the Taliban was doing, the Taliban beating Americans, beating and killing our Afghan allies, and refusing to properly help us against ISIS-K. The committee, despite making public pronouncements, including public pronouncements from Chairman McCaul, that he would bring these guys in for questioning, it never happened.
Do you have any idea why?
We never brought them in. You know, the excuse is that the House Armed Services Committee, which is another Republican-led committee, and technically should be the ones that are handling the military side of things, the House Armed Services Committee has done essentially nothing related to investigating the withdrawal from Afghanistan. And so whenever the House Foreign Affairs Committee decided that it didn't want to go down a certain path related to the military, the excuse would be, well, this kind of falls in the House Armed Services Committee's jurisdiction. But when we did want to bring people in, like we wanted to bring in General Milley and General McKenzie and treat them with kid gloves, well, they're military commanders. We were happy to bring them in. So this jurisdiction question, it's kind of insider baseball, but this jurisdiction thing is used as an excuse when the committee that I worked for didn't want to do something, didn't want to ask the tough questions, didn't want to go down certain investigative avenues. And so the reality is that these guys were never brought in. My final week or so on the committee, after I'd already made it clear that I was going to be resigning, and I'd already put in my 2 weeks, at that point, I was suddenly asked, oh, hey, can you put together like every question that you think that Donahue, Sullivan, and Vaisley should be asked? And I'm like, oh, interesting. Did me saying that I was going to resign mean that you guys are going to finally bring them in? That's great. It's like, no, we're not going to try to bring them in for 8 or 10 hours of questioning. We're going to just send them some questions in writing. Maybe they'll respond, maybe they won't. And I sent dozens and dozens of questions that at the very least they need to be asked in writing. I was told, oh, we're just going to send them like 5 or 10 questions each. So like, this isn't what I'm saying here is this isn't the way that you run a serious investigation. If you're trying to get answers for the Gold Star families, if you're trying to get answers for the service members who were on the ground dealing with this horrific situation, watching the Taliban beating people up and killing people within eyesight of them, this is not how you get answers for people. This is not the way that you run an investigation. It's not serious, and it's not going to get the answers that we need.
McCall's team, after you resigned and blew the whistle on what this investigation really is or is not, they said that, quote, McCall pours his heart and soul into getting answers for our Gold Star families and Afghanistan veterans. Do you have a response to that?
Look, I have no doubt. I mean, there's no denying that Chairman McCaul, in terms of what he's said on this issue, has consistently been very strong. And, you know, it's not nothing that he's out there saying the right thing. It's not nothing, but it's certainly not enough when you're the chairman of a committee with a gavel, with subpoena power. And look, there are certain questions that we just haven't asked. There are these witnesses that we haven't brought in to question. And so I would say I don't really need someone to pouring your heart and soul into it is great. That's amazing if you're able to pour your entire heart and soul into something. I'm asking for actually something much more basic. Just bring in bring in the witnesses that we need to talk to. Just ask the tough questions. That takes a lot less than pouring your entire heart and soul into something. Just like what I'm asking for and what I've been asking for has really just been the basics. Because I could go on and on and on about all of the other things that the investigation should have been doing. Right here, and what I talked about in my resignation letter, is the basics. We're not doing the basics. And this was a very unique opportunity where Republicans are in control, where Republicans have the gavel, where we we've got an election coming up where it's going to be at least something of a referendum on what happened in Afghanistan in 2021. And this is our chance to get answers and accountability. And that opportunity was largely squandered.
Right. From where I stand, actions speak louder than words anyway. Words are empty if they don't match your behavior. And it doesn't seem to me like Chairman McCall's behavior is matching the feelings that he expresses. I don't actually care about his feelings, as nice as that would be if those feelings were helping motivate his actions. They don't seem to be. I don't know. Maybe this is neither here nor there. Maybe it's important. But I always wonder when you have these Republicans who say the right thing, why their actions don't match. Like, is he corrupted by money? Is he just a coward that can't stand being pushed back? Does he just want his cushy seat in Congress and he just doesn't want to really do hard work or say controversial things because he just enjoys going to the congressional gym and that's what he wants to keep? Like, what is the deal with these people?
I think that there's definitely some of that when it comes to Chairman McCaul, for sure. I think that he's certainly friendly with General Milley, and he was at least at one point friendly with Zalmay Khalilzad as well. I don't know if I could characterize those relationships as friendships, but I think he's certainly friendly with them, and that probably colors some of this. But the thing that I mentioned,
friends with them.
Yeah, but the thing I mentioned in the interview, I think is the bigger motivating factor, is that just a decision was made in the committee that they really just don't really want to hold the military accountable.
But
they want to say,
what does that mean? When you say a decision was made in the committee, like somebody presented the idea, somebody okayed it, other people were like, where did that come from? It didn't just autonomously come to life.
Yeah, I mean, it's Chairman McCaul on down, right? I mean, he just really doesn't want to say that the military brass are, if not, okay, I wouldn't say that the military screwed up as badly as the State Department, for instance, but it was close. Like, just because the military did slightly less bad than the State Department doesn't mean that the military didn't screw this up too. And that has kind of been what I've been telling them.
Is McCall former military himself?
He's not. No, he's not. No. Yeah. It's look, I would say that former military guys are oftentimes the ones who understand this dichotomy, this division between the military brass making terrible decisions, but the boots on the ground acting heroically. I think it's oftentimes
Yeah.
Republicans who aren't veterans and don't understand that dynamic, who are kind of the ones that can often be hesitant about really holding generals accountable and really
Right, because
going
they
after
don't
them.
understand the structure. They don't understand that, like,
Right.
generals don't do any of the work. They're
Right,
just
right. And
behind
they,
a desk. They're just political appointees, really. So
right.
I confess I'm extremely interested in this other guy, this Khalilzad, Zalmay Khalilzad. Maybe I'm pronouncing his
Yeah.
name incorrectly. Is he
Yeah.
like a plant? Is he like sympathetic to the Taliban? Like, who the heck is this guy?
I mean, if you ask a lot of the former members of the Afghan government
Yeah.
and former Afghan military who had to deal with them, many of them are convinced that Zal was essentially on the side of the Taliban. Right? That's what they're
Really?
convinced of. That is what they are convinced of. The only options here about Zal are that he's like the worst negotiator and worst diplomat like in history, or he kind of wanted to help the Taliban.
So where did he come from? I earlier in the interview you were saying he was negotiating in 2020. Was he under the Trump administration too?
He was Trump's negotiator with the Taliban. He did a really bad job. He did a really bad job.
So how did he get that job?
Zal has been an ambassador under Republican presidents since George W. Bush. He's had a bunch of different positions. When you meet him, if you don't know who he is and what he's about and what his deal is, he's smart, he's charming, like he's a classic like diplomat, and he's very good at being friendly, figuring out what he has to say to certain people to make them feel special, stuff like that. He's good at that, unless you know who he is, and then you just see it as the act that it is. But
where would he have picked up sympathies for the Taliban if that were the case? Like, what's his history?
So his history. So I want to separate his history from where he may have picked up sympathies for the Taliban, because his history is he was born in Afghanistan, but I do not believe that is like connected to how he may have become in any way sympathetic to the Taliban. He's an Afghan born, but he's an American citizen for a very long time. He worked under George W. Bush as ambassador to, I think he was ambassador to Iraq and Afghanistan. And then Trump did pick him to be the chief negotiator with the Taliban. And it was just a big mistake that Trump made. I mean, there's no really like getting around it, trusting Zal to do this. And it was indicative of Biden and what Biden was planning to do when he got rid of, every Trump policy you can think of, every Trump official that you can think of. But he kept on, like one of the very, 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 very few people from, held over from the Trump administration was like maybe the worst person that Trump put in charge of anything, which is Zal. And so that's kind of what my frustration with the way that we handled him was.
So separating his history from where he picked up sympathies, like where do you think he picked up sympathies?
I think that he really wanted to be the guy who solved Afghanistan. And I think that the way that he saw solving Afghanistan was to just jam the Afghan government and somehow maybe get to a solution where the Taliban is kind of in charge, but it's a mixed government with some former Afghan government people in there. And then Zal gets remembered as the guy who solved Afghanistan. And the way that he kind of tried to solve Afghanistan through diplomacy was by trying to, sort of empowering the Taliban and trying to get the Afghan government to essentially agree to dissolve itself, agree to kind of a joint government with the Taliban, probably with the Taliban mostly in charge. And then Zal can be the guy who solved Afghanistan, if you want to call that solving it. I think
So it's
that
like the same thing as every other politician. It's egotism and idolatry over morality.
Yeah, I think
Okay.
that was a big thing. I think that was a big thing with Zal for sure. And he wanted to be like, remembered as like a Kissinger type diplomat, like someone who really made like a big difference and made his mark. But he did it really just by empowering the Taliban, and he was misleading in 2020 about what the Taliban's intentions were. He was misleading in 2021 when Biden was president, and he still misleads about it today. And so it was very frustrating when the committee was when Chairman McCaul and the committee were trying to present him as, this is the guy who's a truth teller, and if only Biden had just listened to him, nothing would have gone wrong. It's like, no, he was part of the problem. There's this cast of characters who all enabled various aspects of Biden's terrible policies in Afghanistan, and Zal was absolutely one of them.
Interesting. That's so fascinating.
Yeah.
Jerry, remind me the name of your book and then tell people where they can find you online, because your work is fabulous.
Yeah, thanks, Liz. So the book is named Kabul, The Untold Story of Biden's Fiasco and the American Warriors Who Fought to the End. That was co-authored with my great friend, James Hassan. And if you'd like to follow me, you can find me on Twitter at Jerry Dunleavy.
Jerry Dillon. Oh, nice handle. Nice handle. Aren't you lucky if you get that handle? Thanks for coming on today. I really appreciate it. We'll have you on again.
Thanks, Liz. I really appreciate it.